Hello. So today in Module 4, I want to start by talking about what we're going to cover and what we're not going to cover today in this mini lecture. This module is definitely the start of several modules coming up where the amount of content that you really need to master is definitely going to require that you're in the textbook. I don't have the ability to kind of lecture on everything. And so in Module 4, when we talked about measurement, I want to start with this slide. Just as a little hint to you and a way as you are sifting through the content for Module 4 to really make sure you have a grasp on kind of all of the key content of these chapters. So when we talk about measurement, we're talking about all of these bullet point items that you see. The things that are in orange are things that we are going to cover at least in some depth in the next 15 minutes or so in this mini lecture. The things that are in black, I'm either not covering at all or I'm going to say very little about, but I wanted you to know that you need to know what those things are. And so this is sort of a, I don't know, almost like a reading guide kind of slide for you to say, you know, I'm not going to say a whole lot about the difference between operational definitions and nominal definitions, for example, but you do need to know that content. That's one of the things actually that you do in your next draft paper. I'm not going to say much at all about measurement error, but that's covered in the text and is pretty important. I'm also not going to say much about units of analysis and the ecological fallacy, but this is just a heads up to pay attention to what those things mean when you do your readings. What we are going to cover is we're going to start by talking about variables. Obviously, we talk about variables, you know, independent and dependent variable, but also some other types of variables, and just kind of thinking about how to conceptualize what what a study is measuring. And then we're going to spend, honestly, the bulk of our time today talking about reliability and validity. And specifically validity, because that is the focus of the discussion board-based activity that you do in this module. And so we'll spend some time talking about what validity is and the different types of validity. And then we'll talk a little bit towards the end about instrumentation, because again, that's one of the things that it's now time for you to make some decisions about in terms of your studies. Okay, so let's talk first about variables. So we all probably know, just kind of from common knowledge, that there are generally two main variables in any research question: the dependent variable and the independent variable. And while that may sound very simple, I'll tell you that sometimes it hurts your head to think about the difference between independent and dependent variable and be able to identify an independent variable and a dependent variable in any given research question. So an independent variable is X. The independent variable is what causes or explains something, and the dependent variable is the one then being explained or caused. So X leads to Y is a bivariate relationship, right? It's a relationship between two variables. X leads to Y. Now, we're going to talk about the fact that very few research questions are that straightforward. And in most cases, it's not a real linear relationship, X causes Y. But at its very simplest point, that's the relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. Not all research has already identified independent and dependent variables. That's especially true for qualitative research, which we'll talk about a little later in this course. And it's also true that much research, and probably many of your research questions, actually have multiple independent variables. And so you'll want to just really think carefully about what your model is. So this slide reminds you of that, to think carefully about your model. It's rarely a straight X causes Y. And most of the time we're interested in the relationship between X and Y, but we know that there's all of these other compounding variables. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the most common types of compounded variables. Obviously, this is covered in more depth in your chapter. So the first one is called an extraneous variable. And an extraneous variable is an outside influence that's unaccounted for. which actually impacts the dependent variable. That unaccounted for is the key piece. Extraneous variables shouldn't happen in your study because you should account for them. But oftentimes what happens is, we think we're looking at X versus Y, and we find out after the fact, we never asked about this other variable, but that's actually the cause of it. That would be an extraneous variable. A mediating variable, by contrast, is an intervening variable that we know is affecting it. So there's an example here. So if we were looking at the relationship between education level and spending habits, and there was a hypothesis there, right, that said more higher educated people spend more money. Well, what we might discover is it's not really that education level impacts their spending habits. Instead, there's a mediating variable there, an intervening variable, and that's income, right? It's not really education level that's affecting the spending habits, but it's people who are more educated have more money, and income leads to spending habits. So that's an example of an intervening or a mediating variable. Then there's also something called a moderating variable, and moderating variables are variables that impact the strength or the direction of a relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. So it just means it's saying that there might be a variable that causes the relationship to be more true at certain times. And so you'll want to kind of identify those variables as well. Okay, and so what are you going to do with all of this, or what do you do when you look at a research study? Well, in your draft paper, and as you start to think about your research, you are asked to define your variables. And you're actually asked to give a nominal definition and an operational definition. And like I said, there's much more content in your chapter about this, but on a very basic level, a nominal definition is a narrative word-based definition. And an operational definition is you saying this is how you're actually going to measure it. And so you need to have both. You need to say, when I talk about race, this is what I mean. And then you need to say, and here's how I'm going to measure race. And that's your operational definition. And you need to also make sure that you identify all different dimensions of a variable, as well as the moderating variables that might go into play. And one of the things to keep in mind in terms of your operational definition, and we're going to come back to this at the end, is the use of existing scales. We're going to talk about that as a standardized instrument. So, if you're measuring depression levels, then you could give an operational definition of depression and say, I'm going to measure depression levels using the Beck's depression inventory. And that would be your operational definition. So we'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. Okay. Now we want to talk a little bit about the elements of measurement. And this is where we talk about reliability and validity. So reliability is about consistency. So the definition of reliability is a particular measurement technique when applied repeatedly to the same object yields the same results every time. So this doesn't necessarily mean something is accurate, it just means something's consistent. So when we ask how reliable is this study, what we're asking is, if we gave this study multiple times, would people score the same, right? Would they get the same result every time? And so that's about consistency. And the difference between that and validity is about accuracy. So validity is asking the question, does it actually measure what it's supposed to measure? So validity is about accuracy. The best example I have of this, it's my clip art picture here to remember to tell you a story. The best example I have of this is the shower dial in my shower. So I recently got a new shower, and it has one of these shower dials like the picture on here, where it tells me what the temperature of my shower is, right? And so I now kind of know that I like the way the shower feels when that dial is somewhere between 90 and 95 degrees. And so now when I get in the shower, I just know if I turn it to that same place, 90 to 95 degrees, that I'm going to like the way the shower feels, because it always feels the same when the dial is between 90 and 95 degrees. Now, that's really about reliability. It's not accuracy. I have no idea if that's actually 90 to 95 degrees, right? It could be that it's actually 85 or 100. But all I know is it's reliable and it's consistent, and it gets me what it is that I want, right? So that's the difference between reliability and validity. So anytime we look at a measure, anytime we look at a study, we're going to be trying to assess how valid is it. And there are 4 basic types of validity that we want to look at. And they go on this slide, by the way, from kind of least sophisticated to most sophisticated. And this is what you are going to do in the discussion activity for this module. You're going to assess a couple instruments on all types of validity. So remember, validity is asking the question, is it measuring what it says it's going to measure? And there are 4 different levels of that. So face validity is just asking the question, does it look good? It's very simple, it's very unsophisticated, and it's just looking at, a survey tool or a measurement and saying, this says that it's supposed to be measuring knowledge of HIV behaviors. Yeah, looks good, right? And that's face validity. Very simple. Then we go to the next level, which is content validity. And content validity asks the question, does it cover the range of possibilities? The best example I can give you of this that will make sense to you are quizzes. So, in each module in this course, for example, we give a quiz, right? And if the quiz says it's supposed to cover chapters 8, 9, and 10 of the book, but all of the quiz questions actually cover chapter 8, and there are no questions about 9 and 10. Then we would say that quiz has very low content validity because it doesn't cover the range of possibilities if that quiz is supposed to be measuring your knowledge of the module. So so content validity is making sure that all of the possibilities are accounted for. Criterion validity is the next most sophisticated type of validity, and it asks the question, does it match the real world? Does it match the real world? Usually, criterion validity, we're looking at whether the instrument measures some sort of external criterion, maybe a contrast group or a diagnosis or another instrument, something like that. Let me give you 2 examples that I think will help make this make sense. So criterion validity is asking, does it match the real world? So 2 examples of this. One is an interesting example that we probably all have stories of, right? And that is this girl down on the bottom of the slide who just got her driver's license, right? And so how many of us know people who, go and take the driver's test and they pass? They pass with flying colors. But we've driven in their car and we question whether they're good drivers. It's scary, they maybe aren't the best driver. That would be an example of low criterion validity. The driver's test said they passed. Sitting in the car with them leads us to believe they're not the best driver. Another example, and it's the happy face, sad face picture, is, again, going back to, there was a study that was measuring depression levels or like mood, right? And the survey came back and said the person has really low level of depression. But what we see in front of us is a person who never smiles, right? What that is the real world, that person's affect not matching up to what the score on an inventory said. That would be low criterion validity. It doesn't match the real world. And then lastly, something called construct validity. Construct validity is pretty complicated. I'm just going to briefly mention it here, but it asks the question, does the way it measures fit with definitions and theory? In other words, are the questions that are being asked, is the way that the survey or instrument is designed, is it measuring whatever the variable is the way that the researcher has described it? And so, for example, if we know that self-esteem, that's the picture down here, if we know that self-esteem is about self-worth and self-confidence and openness and self-disclosure, but we only ask questions about self-esteem and we don't ask questions about those other things, then we could say it has low construct validity. And then lastly, just a picture to make sure that we understand then the relationship between reliability and validity. Something can be reliable without being valid. That's my example of the shower head. But what we really want is something that is both valid and reliable. You get the same results every time, and they are the right results. And so we can use a standardized instrument to do this. And that's one possibility. And so that's one of the things you're going to look for. But pay attention in your textbook to the pros and cons of using standardized instruments. You'll see this slide again on the discussion board activity for today or for this week. So I will meet you on the discussion board.